transplants? Dr. Kassam, how do you feel about them?
They're the best thing. Jeff, great to talk to you. But microbiota transplants in particular, I would say all transplants aren't created equal. I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
We'll definitely talk more about that. And you talked about microbiota transplants, so you took the punchline of my joke. But welcome to How It's Med, the podcast where we absolutely jar our audience with poorly scripted introductions, and where we also happen to chat with the greats shaping the future of healthcare and health tech. My name is Jeff, and sometimes alongside my co-host Abdo, we chat with people who, again, shape the future of healthcare and health technology. Our guest today is Dr. Zain Kassam. He's the unparalleled co-founder of the unicorn company Finch Therapeutics Group. Zain, how are you doing today?
Really well, Jeff. Thanks for having me, and excited to unpack a conversation about entrepreneurship, about medicine, and the story that connects them in between.
Yeah, I think what I want to do first is unpack that thing about microbiota transplants. What do you actually mean by that, Zain?
Sure, yeah. So it turns out there are trillions of bugs on and in us, and particularly in our colon and our intestine, and they've evolved with us. They're like part of humans. Effectively, you get them when you're born into this world, and they stay with you until you die. And they turns out they play a phenomenally important role in health and disease that we've really just started to uncover. They're basically a missing organ, a virtual organ that we've just discovered. And what happens is when that's disturbed, there ends up being health consequences. And actually, what a microbiota transplant is the transfer of those healthy microbes from a healthy individual into an individual that's in a disease state, with the hope of ameliorating that clinical condition and restoring the microbiome.
All right. And the most common circumstance in which I've heard of the microbiome is the gut. So is that where you started, or are there other, I guess, microbiomes that you've targeted as well?
So my focus as a gastroenterologist has always been in the gut microbiome, but there are others that have focused in other areas of the human body and transplant. Probably the one that's probably it's just starting to emerge is vaginal microbiome transplants for conditions related to women's health, which is fascinating as well, and I think emerging.
That's
Also, skin microbiome administration is starting to evolve as well. And so that's kind of also another hot area in microbiome sciences. And so I think the pioneers, the start of this field, have been in the gut, because that's where the bulk of the microbiome is. And but I think now folks are starting to understand the impact of not just the GI microbiome impacting other areas of the body, which we could talk more about, everything from the brain to cancer, and immunology in general, but also starting to realize that there are microbes that sit on our skin, or that are kind of in the in the vaginal cavity, that have a huge and meaningful impact in other areas of medicine.
that that explanation of the microbiome is far beyond anything that I've ever understood. So I think we went a little too in media res there in terms of the absolutely amazing work that you've done. So in order to give, I guess, the listeners a bit of context, let's flash back to 2004. This guy named Mark, maybe Zuckerberg, had just founded this company where you can connect people online. I don't know what use that would be, but you were in med school at that point. How did you get there?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I'll even zone back further. How did I find my way into medical school? So my parents are immigrants, South Asian background, came, basically with the shirts on their backs to Canada under civil unrest in East Africa, and really valued education, as many communities do. And so it almost felt like I was destined to have a career in one of three things: doctor, lawyer, engineer. It's almost preordained. And I was really bad at math. So can't be an engineer. And so I was between two fields that I was like kind of exploring a little bit, the legal profession and medicine. And I had a really amazing mentor in high school, believe it or not, who was a law professor, and I had a chance to chat with her, and I ended up, because I thought I liked some of the legal aspects, I ended up doing competitive debating, and she took me under her wing a little bit. And as I grew up in Ottawa, that's where the Supreme Court is, and one of her colleagues was a Supreme Court justice. believe it or not. And I ended up having dinner with the Supreme Court justice and my, a mentor of mine. And she tried to kind of ask some questions and said, well, kind of boil it up and say, well, if you go down the legal pathway, if you go, undergraduate in the arts, kind of towards the legal pathway, um, it's really hard to get into the medical path. But if you go into the sciences, it's going to open up that medical path a little bit more, especially because law is changing and you can always pivot the other way. So you're leveraging sciences and law at the time, IP, DNA in the courtroom was much more, novel. And so the lesson that I learned is about maintaining optionality, actually. So I kept that optionality from both law and medicine a little bit longer. And I had the privilege of having another mentor in the sciences, Karim Damji, who is a physician who kind of introduced me to an ophthalmologist, actually, introduced me to the what medicine was. Because, as someone that didn't have a family of physicians, I had a perception of what it was, but there's a mismatch. There's, a lot of differences in what medicine actually is, what the perceptions are. And then also he introduced me to another mentor of mine when I was in high school, Rashmi Kothari at the Ottawa Research Institute. And I ended up doing, as a high school student, kind of in a lab, learning how to do, benchtop research in NS effectively. And then those kind of confluence of factors nudged me into a Bachelor of Health Sciences program at McMaster University, which had a focus, I would say, indirectly on medicine. I think most of my classmates ended up in medical school. And I think that's kind of the journey that took me into medicine. A bit passive, but also pretty active, and I think shaped by mentors that ended up being the journey along the way.
Okay, so I mean, it seems like you had you actually took your time deciding, whereas I guess for me it was purely just medicine. I remember like for me interviewing at like a school before, and my mom telling me to tell them that we want to go into medicine. So we took very different paths. But how was your path through medical school overall? Because I didn't know what I wanted to do before. I didn't even know there was residency going to medical school, so I was shocked. How did you find your way to gastroenterology? Was it like a similar torturous path? Torturous or
Yeah,
tortuous?
great question.
Windy path.
It was windy, but maybe not as turbulent or as windy as other people's story. I've always loved diversity. And one of the things that um, I found really exciting was the ability in internal medicine to be able to be a specialist amongst a wide variety of areas. And I really liked gastroenterology because it allowed you to pivot between not only using your hands, but also using your mind. Uh, Long-term relationships with patients with inflammatory bowel disease, shorter term relationships with people that have GI bleeds, elderly patients that have colon cancer, young patients that have, ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And I think that's probably the cognitive answer, but there's also like the soul answer. And the soul answer is, my dad has ulcerative colitis, a type of inflammatory bowel disease. And certainly during the medical school route, we had some difficult moments from a medical perspective, and thankfully he's much better now. But it's always been an inspiration of, family always shapes who you are directly or indirectly, and personal health journeys have a massive impact on your trajectory. And so I think those are the like seeds of what inspired me to explore that. I'll say that I explored a bunch of other fields within medicine that I was really excited about, within internal medicine. So rheumatology, I really enjoyed as well. And I focused some research on areas that crossed both rheumatology and GI. So I did like ankylosing spondylitis type related arthritis, for example. And that to me was very interesting because it allowed me to kind of play in multiple areas. And I try to give that advice. I just talked about optionality. If you're really interested in GI, really interested in cardiology, maybe you should do like work on antiplatelet agents and GI bleeds, right? Because it kind of crosses over both areas, and lets you to have a taste across different types of mentors and how to fit, right? A lot of medicine is about a personality fit. And also more importantly, and I think maybe some of your previous guests have mentioned this, you really have to like the most mundane thing that specialty does, not just the exciting thing. And that's what ultimately tipped me to GI versus rheumatology, is that I didn't love, you know, fibromyalgia, osteoarthritis, some of the bread and butter osteoporosis. I really loved, really narrow aspects of rheumatology, kind of when you hear hoofbeats, think zebra. I love that. I love like a vasculitis, and I think that creative mindset. But I really enjoyed dealing with patients with inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome, that were or GI bleeds that were more bread and butter GI, not just the zebras, but the horses as well. And I think that led me to more of a cognitive decision, a real life decision of what specialty to kind of target.
Mhm. I mean, you mentioned that you had done some clinical research or some benchtop research before medical school, and you've mentioned research again. Has research always been important to you and something that you enjoyed? Because, I mean, with people that we've chatted with before, some of their responses as to why they went to medicine was specifically to avoid research.
Right. I think it's always been a blend. I've always been a curious guy, and to me, to find answers to like difficult problems, whether that problem lies in biology or whether it lies in a clinical puzzle, to me are kind of two coins on two sides of a coin, and I think they're quite synergistic. I was just talking to a colleague of mine about the importance of being able to be a polyglot and see across both those domains. I think that's where true innovation happens, is when you're able to cross over and kind of see the other world and then cross apply it. And so I've always enjoyed both. I actually thought for a really long time I would end up doing an MD PhD. I ended up taking another kind of career path, which we'll talk more about, I'm sure, from a training perspective. But I've always enjoyed research, and I've also loved the collaboration aspect of it. I think we get that in clinical medicine as well with multidisciplinary teams, of course, but there's something different about different labs working together to solve a problem, completely different mindsets with different tools, the writing collaboration process. I've always found that kind of completely fascinating. And I think the people I've looked up to the most been able to be transformative in multiple areas of their career at different times, perhaps, but not always at the exact same time, but transfer in multiple areas. And so research has always been kind of near and dear to me. But not necessarily maybe I think it's important to know why people get turned off of research. And often it's because the incentives are set up in unusual ways. For example, being first author and last author and publish or perish. And I think for me, that's been something I've actively worked out of. And so my publication track record is an industry actually. And I've been very fortunate to work with amazing people and collaborators in publishing over 200 papers and abstracts, but not in an academic setting. And it didn't matter to me ever if I was a first author or last author or which journal. It didn't even really matter. As long as that information got out there and people can build off of it, that like collaboration, that sense of community was always the most important aspect of research. Fortunately, I think sometimes academia is a ripe for disruption with realigning what the right incentives are to measure success. And I get it, like publishing and H-index and citations are really easy to measure, but are they necessarily the um, right KPIs? Right? I'm not sure they are. And I gave a talk to CIHR in one of their um, large grant kind of summits, and they asked me to come because it was an academic group had won significant research funding and a significant commitment of funds for the microbiome, and they said we love kind of academics and papers in Nature and Science and Cell and New England Journal of Medicine are great, but what we really care about is seeing those ideas translate to impact Canadian lives. And Zaid, you've done that a little bit. Can you maybe help share your story and your lessons to some of the academics in the Canadian ecosystem to be able to maybe stretch their brain in different direction to potentially think about transformational impact, kind of not just in an academic arena, but touching patient lives kind of more directly. And I think I've always been a bit of a pulling a word out of Bill Gates, an impatient optimist. If I don't think I can make an impact in 5 years with that research is not for me. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It's just not for me. And so I think that's been, a north star for me in terms of how I've moved with my research career.
Mhm. That's fascinating in terms of the focus on trying to get research out into actually transformative, I guess, clinical applications that touch people's lives. Because I feel the exact same way, but you went beyond a residency in gastroenterology and went on to do an MPH. What was the story behind that? Why an MPH?
Yeah, great. This is that. I mean, everything always starts with a patient. So I was in my training and I had this 82-year-old patient. She was British. Uh, She told me she looked like the Queen of England. I'm uncertain, but she was very convinced. She loved her grandkids. She loved gardening. She's this wonderful sweetheart of a woman. And I saw her, I think it's like 2 a.m. My double at Tim Hortons in the emergency department. She had this terrible case of an infection called C. diff, which is like a antibiotic superbug. And she'd failed the most potent antibiotics in the world, multiple rounds, and she was still tied to a toilet. She was so fed up, she wanted to have her colon cut out. And the time we did something kind of experimental called a fecal transplant, as we talked a little bit about. And lo and behold, Jack, like she was gardening 2 days later. And I'm like, wow, this is incredible. It was the
Wow.
closest thing I had seen to a miracle in medicine. And so I was very curious about it. And, step one for me is like, let's get that research out there. And so work with my mentors, Paul Moyetti, Christine Lee, Richard Hunt, and many others to put together the largest case series of the time, publish that. And then I was very curious why everyone wasn't doing it, right? And so get back into the literature, and I did a systematic review and meta-analysis to aggregate all the data that's out there in the fields, and try to understand why people aren't doing it. And on the one hand, I saw wonderful, like the efficacy rates were really high, the safety profile was wonderful, but the catch was they're all case reports and case series, really poor clinical studies, not the type of clinical trials that change hearts and minds of doctors, patients, and key stakeholders. And so that was kind of the inspiration for me to say, okay, great. This is what I want to do with my career, this new paradigm shifting technology. And I want to become an academic gastroenterologist. My mentor was an academic gastroenterologist. My mentor's mentor was an academic gastroenterologist. I was almost being kind of bred to be an academic GI doctor, to be able to do the CIHR and NIH type grants to kind of further this field in an academic context. And that was my lens. But and so I was really lucky. I got a Frank Knox Memorial Fellowship, so full scholarship down to Harvard to do my Master's of Public Health in quantitative methods. So basically, half biostatistics, half epidemiology, but really just a focus on clinical trials. And so, when I was in Boston, I was serendipity struck, I guess you can say. A group at MIT cited my work, and I'm like, MIT, they like invent the internet and train monkeys to control robots. Like, what are they doing with microbes? And so I pinged the PI, Eric Alm, who was in the Department of Biological Engineering, and said, thanks for the citation. Really appreciate it. Really surprised you're working with microbes. Would love to kind of talk shop. And ended up connecting with Eric, and super hit it off. And he's like, what are you doing next year? Like, I'm going back to Canada, be an academic gastroenterologist. Well, don't go yet. I'm like, okay, well, he's like, yeah, you understand GI, you understand clinical trials, a little bit about the microbiome, but let me teach you more. Come do a postdoc with me, a postdoc at MIT in biological engineering and microbiome engineering. I said, that's really interesting, but I'm an MD. I don't think I could do a postdoc. He's like, no, we'll figure it out. It's a thing. We can make it happen. You have a doctorate. And so he didn't take no for an answer. And I said, well, I said, Eric, we got to sweeten the pot. I'd love to do something else on top of that. I said, we'll meet my grad student, Mark, as in Mark Smith. And Mark at the time was starting a company up called OpenBiome. Can kind of think of it not like the Red Cross, but the Brown Cross, right? He wasn't doing a blood bank. He was doing a stool bank. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. I said, this is incredible. It reminded me of back in McMaster, when it was really difficult to find donors, to screen them and go through that. I'm like, brilliant idea. Who's doing your medical oversight? And he kind of points at me and says, you are. Join as a co-founding chief medical officer. And so that started my journey into OpenBiome, which I could talk a little bit more about.
I do want to talk about OpenBiome because it's a big, I guess, portion of your journey that would be a mistake to miss. But I guess there are some questions there overall in terms of the early stage of your development, or your supposed development at that stage, into an academic gastroenterologist. You talk a lot about optionality, but being an academic gastroenterologist that focuses on microbiome is the opposite of having optionality. You're niching in real hard. So why did you focus on that approach at that time? And has it helped you expand your optionality since?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that the microbiome at that time was a nascent field. It was kind of white snow. And so there was a lot of optionality intrinsically built into that. But my first thought was not actually to be, just a general in the microbiome. I did a translational microbiome elective at the University of Calgary. with Paul Beck and Subrata Ghosh and Gil Kaplan and a bunch of other mentors. And the advice they gave me is my vision was to do inflammatory bowel disease microbiome, like a very clear vertical. And Paul Beck actually kind of pulled me aside, like, you're thinking about this the right way. The microbiome is definitely really exciting, but go broader. Just go much more horizontally instead of so vertically, and locking yourself into a very narrow field. And I think he gave me optionality at that level from a therapeutic perspective. He also talked to me a lot, and also some of my other mentors, like Richard Hunt and Paul Lieti, about using academic medicine as a platform to do other things. So, for example, Paul Beck has a company that he's involved with. There's been a bridge towards being able to spin out their technology, which I think is the right thing. And Richard Hunt had companies he worked with very closely. He worked closely with pharmaceutical group that also had his own company. And I think these are the types of opportunities that I hadn't fully appreciated. I think when I was thinking about research, as a high school student at the bench, that does give you optionality. You can be an academic and work with true innovation at the bed. Some don't want to, and some want to keep that very clear and different. But my time at MIT also changed that. It was almost like an expectation that you would start a company. The KPIs, the key performance indicators, were, generating IP and spinning out companies. And the groups that were really looked up to were not the ones that had the longest publication history, although that was great. It was the ones that had the most impact on company formation. And so folks like Bob Langer, who started so many companies, I can't even name them, that's totally changed the world in drug delivery technology, is kind of the epitome of, an MIT tenured professor whose impact, of course, is in research and of course at the publications, but that you're not done your journey yet. That's just step one of the journey. You need to see that technologies through, and need to get off to people that are able to take that to the patient or the population. And so that kind of frame shift was really, really valuable to me to understand optionality. And I don't think I had that when I was, at the beginning of my journey. I think I picked that up kind of as I was the final chapters in Canada and then in the US, where I think the frame around venture creation and entrepreneurship is a little bit different.
So I'm going to follow this tangent because there's this one point here that you keep bringing up: companies that help generate or transform research into actual innovation that helps people. Why must innovation, or why has your experience of innovation come in the form of companies? Why is it so difficult to create cures, to create therapies just from a pure academic environment?
Yeah, no, I think that just like in medicine, we have specialties, right? You wouldn't expect an obstetrician to do your colonoscopy. You probably wouldn't expect your gastroenterologist to deliver your baby. And it just takes a very different skill set that you have to create to be able to have the maximal impact. I think you can definitely create value in academia, but it has limits because you have a full-time job typically being a clinician. And so there are other models that you can do in academia that are very successful. And so you can out-license technology, right? As you have a discovery or an invention, you can partner with the technology transfer offices academia to find the right partner on the other end to take that forward. You're still a founder, you can still be part of it, but you're not, crushing 80 to 90 hours a week on moving that technology forward when you have, a 40 to 50 or 60 hour a week clinical duty. So partly it's time, partly is skill. And I think, I think there's just this haze around, I'll talk about the Canadian landscape of industry in general that's being a little bit kind of icky, maybe a little bit. And I certainly had some of that when I was at the Harvard School of Public Health, which is very focused on, equity, social justice, which are all things that I care deeply about. But there was a transformative talk by Jim Kim. So Jim Kim started Partners in Health, one of the most premier organizations in social justice to basically brought HIV medicines to Haiti. And he was at the time the head of the World Bank. And he came back and he actually kind of gave a lecture speaking about this issue. We have to get out of the ivory tower and find ways to partner with our industry colleagues, our pharmaceutical colleagues, because that's what they did in Haiti. They worked with pharma to bring HIV medicines to lower socioeconomic status that had been impoverished, that didn't have access to those therapies. And by putting up walls, there's no way you're going to be able to make a transformational impact in that way. And that pattern of behavior, I just start to hear that theme more and more. The Prime Minister of Norway came and said something very similar. I talked to some very senior level folks, like Dirk Jeebers at Johnson and Johnson, and Janssen, I guess, is their drug development arm, and they all had this like similar ethos that the way to see that impact through is to find those partnerships or to build it yourself. And for me, that was very important. Those three kind of talks and conversations help me kind of reframe my orientation around companies, industry, and bringing new medicines to patients and how best to do that.
I don't want to delve too deep in this topic just yet, because that is a huge part of what I want to discuss later. And we haven't discussed the entirety of your journey quite yet. But let's go back to your story. You had been doing work at MIT and OpenBiome. I guess tell me more about your experience with OpenBiome and how that led you further down your path.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the OpenBiome story is one of these like legacy moments that I think in my career to this point in time. And so, at the time it was like very difficult to get microbiota transplantation. It was literally impossible. There's maybe like half a dozen people in the entire US doing it, maybe two, maybe three people in all of Canada. It was very difficult to do because the operational consequences were quite significant. You had to find donors, you had to screen them, you had to like use blenders. It was awful. And the screen rates were really high and you didn't get remunerated for it. So you're having these physicians who are just doing it really as passion projects out of the goodness of their heart. And so there's this huge operational barrier that was occurring. And that kind of inspired the OpenBiome journey in a way, because, the biggest innovations don't have to be a slick algorithm or a discovery in a test tube. Sometimes they're operational. And so the idea to centralize the process of like a stool bank, and was quite revolutionary at the time. And so putting that together, and we scale that company to more than 100 employees. We treated more than 65,000 patients in all 50 states and in 7 countries, with more than 1,300 hospitals. We did more than 40 clinical trials to really catalyze research in the microbiome space. Published a lot along the way, won grants from the CDC and many others, and really took this field off as a platform. And now, to be clear, it was predominantly for clinically we were treating patients with C. difficile not responsive to standard therapy. But our research arm was also quite significant. We did studies in hepatic encephalopathy, the first one of its kind, obesity, you name it, we did it kind of thing, inflammatory bowel disease. And I think that really helped the research community almost as a tool to get this intervention, in addition to the clinical community, who just needed, material for their patients, just like the ones that I spoke about my first patient.
Mhm. So, I mean, it's fascinating the amount of, I guess, downstream impact your work had. But I'm just curious, like, how did you break down those barriers to operation? Because you're absolutely right. One doc trying to get patients to donate microbiome samples and then trying to screen them, failing, and then not being remunerated for it is an unsustainable system. How did you make it sustainable, or how did the team make it sustainable with OpenBiome, and
Yeah,
what role did you
it
play
was.
there?
Yeah, so I was the chief medical officer there, and so
Yeah.
focused on a couple of different elements. So not only was I, helped guide the strategic aspect of the organization,
Yeah.
I was the one that helped kind of pioneer the screening program and screening profile of how to make sure doctors and patients felt comfortable. And the bar, if the bar was really like kind of at a 5 in terms of screening that most people were doing, we were doing it at like a 30. Like, it was like orders of magnitude higher than what clinicians were doing in and of themselves. And we could do that because there was economies of scale, right? So we could just test a lot more and screen a lot more than the average clinician could do, because it was through the payment perspective, it was hard. Patients had to pay out of pocket often. Insurance companies didn't really cover the payment of the screening. And so we use kind of like, basic business principles of economies of scale to be able to do that. And also from a safety perspective, safety always came first. It's always in any type of medical profession. And so for us, I spent a lot of time talking to clinicians and having a clinical advisor to make sure we were screening appropriately for the comprehensiveness of pathogens along the way. So then product was safe. And that was kind of element number one. So win hearts and minds on safety. Element number two was we were a nonprofit model. And so we made sure that the cost price point was as low as humanly possible within the confines of doing this. So it was because it wasn't being paid by insurance companies. And it was a difficult thing to do for clinicians. And so we tried to work as much as possible to make sure that things were reasonable from a remuneration perspective. And then the last leg of the stool is relationships, right? Forming really deep relationships was really critical to the success of OpenBiome. I was really, because I had a track record of publishing in the space and had led it from an academic perspective, having a conversation with, I would say the medical influencers of the universe that were the ones that were doing the fecal transplants to have a conversation about what we're doing and why we're doing it this way, and could make their life a lot easier. They're looking for an opportunity, but they want to make sure it was at the right group. And then it kind of just took fire. It kind of once you start to work with, Harvard and UCSF and down in California, and then it just starts to take off. And then there's almost like a FOMO, a fear of missing out component kind of takes off. If you look at the adoption kind of curve, business paradigms, it felt very much like we were barely keeping up with the demand because it was so much. Because if one hospital did it, the next one did. And I think that was a really important aspect. And our goal was to make this democratized and to kind of make sure that everyone had access to this therapy. And one of the outcomes of that is we did some GIS analysis, and over 99.9% of the US population within a 4-hour drive of a clinical partner. And that took a paradigm shift, because before OpenBiome, there's only like half a dozen clinicians in the entire country in the US doing this. And I think that was really meaningful because it almost made it a universal therapy. Now there's challenges with that universal therapy. It was mostly given by colonoscopy or enemas. And I think there was an opportunity to build off of that, which we can talk about with Finch. But there was this huge opportunity to, as kind of proof point, that this therapy is effective, that this therapy has a tolerable safety profile. And along the way, we got a chance to do a lot of research to show impacts in other clinical conditions as a proof of concept, as a proof of principle. It's an incredible where you see like a case of, again, case reports. So, with a grain of salt, not the clinical trial necessarily, but a patient getting treated with C. diff and other medical conditions getting better. So a celiac patient growing back their villi, or an alopecia patient, growing back hair. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to be an effective therapy, but it does mean there's equipoise to explore that from a research perspective, to do the clinical trials next, to change hearts and minds of doctors. And we subsequently did some of those, including large studies in inflammatory bowel disease, as well as C. diff, to start to make sure those clinical trials are up to snuff and are up to the quality that clinicians expect and that regulators expect to be able to advance the field forward.
Mhm. So I guess my question from this point is, you were doing such a fascinating job building out OpenBiome as a nonprofit. Why couldn't this work have continued as a nonprofit? And as a counterpart to the question, why Finch? What was the story behind that?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's probably a couple different reasons. So first, the FDA made it very clear that they felt that microbiome interventions were drugs. They were from a regulatory paradigm. They allowed a temporary, they call enforcement discretion, to not apply the principles of a drug in this temporary period, but their message was very clear that they felt that microbiome therapies, including first generation microbiome therapies like fecal transplant, are a drug, and that the regulatory paradigm would close or change meaningfully once the approvals of these types of therapies happened. And so that was kind of like step number one of recognizing the landscape from a regulatory perspective. And step number two was, the way that we were giving most of our fecal transplants was by a colonoscopy or an enema. And gosh, I'm a gastroenterologist. I love doing colonoscopies, but turns out patients don't love them. And so we really worked towards moving the entire microbiome organ in a pill, right? That was really important to be able to give the entire community in a pill. And that was actually a really hard problem to solve because when you try to freeze dry microbes, you actually kill a bunch of them. And so when you try to optimize the conditions to keep some of the bugs, you kill these bugs. And then when you try to protect these bugs, you kill these bugs. And so trying to keep the entire community intact is a kind of a very significant technical challenge. We worked with a group, an in-licensed group, actually at the University of Minnesota, Alex Karutz and Mike Sadowski, to bring that technology. And we thought that was a paradigm shifting technology to be able to give the entire organ back was so important. Similarly, we also thought we were the first to apply machine learning to the microbiome at MIT in Eric Holmes' lab. And so we also thought there was an opportunity to develop precision-based therapies, microbiome therapies for other clinical conditions. C. diff, it was, the microbial composition didn't really matter. As long as it was safe, it was good to go. But it turned out when we did a big clinical trial at McMaster in ulcerative colitis, a type of inflammatory bowel disease, the trial was positive, but only one donor worked. The other donors actually didn't work. And so what was special about that donor? What was special about their microbial signature? And so that's exactly what we start to think through is, cool, can we apply machine learning by triangulating the bugs that were not in the patient, found in the donor, found in the successful recipient versus those that were not successful? And you can start to use AI technologies to be able to pull out the key bugs, test them in clinic, and test them at the bench, and then move into clinic. And so we have a partnership deal with Takeda, which is a large pharmaceutical company that is really specialized in probably one of the world leaders in inflammatory bowel disease. And so we have a partnership deal moving an asset forward with the microbiome in a very different approach. And so that was the impetus for Finch. And so we spun up Finch with the thought process of getting an approved microbiome therapeutic. And we did. We moved forward in having the first positive pivotal trial of an oral microbiome therapeutic, a large double-blind placebo-controlled trial with nearly 200 people and over 50 sites. And that was certainly one of my crowning achievements is shaping that study and moving that forward, because it takes me back to my original story of why did I get in this field in the first place, is to do the clinical trial to change hearts and minds of doctors, and to do those double-blind placebo-controlled trials were just so gratifying to see that as one of the one of the crowning achievements so far in my career.
That's fascinating. And before I talk more about the partnerships, because that seems to be a huge part of the work that you've done, much less the mentorships, which seem to shape you as a person. Did you get a letter from the FDA saying that what you were doing was not cool and that you needed to transform it into something that's FDA approved? And if so, what was that, like a scary moment, or how did that go?
Yeah, so it wasn't a letter per se. I think the FDA has had a number of summits where they don't know to their credit, they've been very flexible and very patient centric. The FDA has been amazing, and they've called essentially FDA hearings and meetings, a series of them over the course of the years, to bring together key stakeholders, patients, patient advocacy, clinicians, industry representatives, and have regulators, of course, a really deep multidisciplinary conversation about their thought process around regulating this space. And I think they've been incredible and really cutting edge and really patient centric. And although you don't ever get a letter per se, they made their intentions kind of really pretty clear about what they expect this field to be, where to go, and that their hands are tied from a statute perspective. There's a set of criteria and statutes to define a drug versus not a drug, and that they felt that this was a biological drug. And I agree with them, actually. I think that their rationale was sound. And I think that their thought process was very reasonable, because the quality standards need to be very high in this field. And although OpenBiome had a very, very high bar, from a regulatory perspective, they can't regulate one group or another differently. They have to regulate everyone the same. And they couldn't regulate to the level of purity and potency that you could do with, biological drugs. And so, someone in Boise could just decide, I'm not going to screen anything, actually, right? And just got to go do it. And that wouldn't be a safe thing. And so the FDA is really thoughtful about patient safety, but they found this amazing compromise to be able to serve patients today, um, as much as possible until approved therapies, have kind of moved their way through the clinical pipeline. And so I'm a credit to the agency because it's a very difficult decision when you hear the patients, clamoring for this therapy in which they said, well, no, this is a drug, and how did it into creative solutions? I'm just so impressed by the regulators, um, at the FDA and Health Canada, quite frankly, as well. They're just been incredible thought partners. And kudos to them.
That I mean, I like initially when you told me about the FDA laying out that like that their hands were tied, that they need to move forward with like making sure that the microbiome transplants needed to be standardized. I was like, that must be terrifying because that's a federal agency coming down on you. But the way that you phrased it, it seems a lot more like nuance, and I'm glad that there's like a lot of listening to what patients need overall. But to go back to the work that you've done, you mentioned a lot about partnerships, for example, with Takeda. What underlies the formation of the partnerships as well as the selection of partnerships that you think are best to move an organization forward? Because meeting people is a one and done on LinkedIn, for example. But how do you transform that into a meaningful partnership that drives actual innovation for products to come to life?
Yeah, I think it depends on what type of partnerships you're trying to form. And so there are business development partnerships, and when you are trying to work with um, larger pharmaceutical companies to move forward, an asset. There are academic partnerships or strategic partnership where you work with academics who are doing the clinical trials, for example. There are patient advocacy partnerships where you try to help patients and see their voice. And actually, I thought that was a really important one for me. I wanted to bring patients into the design of clinical trials because they're the ones going through it. So I thought that was really important. So it really depends on the type of partnership you're trying to, catalyze. At the end of the day, like it's always about the individual one-on-one relationships and sorting out what are the goals, what's the vision, and being as clear about that as possible. You can't find out synergies unless you're transparent, and start from a base of trust. And so for usually the types of partnerships end up being serendipitous, and spontaneous and through a Rolodex, right? The people that you know, or, oh, I know this person and this person. And one of my mentors, Richard Hunt, always told me, and this is the mantra that I hold very near and dear to my heart, talked about it, I think maybe in our setup call, was being a connector of people and ideas. Has always been kind of my core value, my core like compass is to try to connect people and ideas. It may not help me directly, but maybe three skip level that's going to make an impact somewhere else, and do that truly altruistically. I think if you kind of approach the universe in that way, kind of good things happen. And so the partnerships in all areas, whether it's academic ones or patient advocacy or business development partnerships, have always been through that skip level connection, or leading with kind of like your transparency and clarity of vision. And good things tend to happen with good people. And we've been really lucky with our partnership today. They're amazing partners. And I sat on the joint development committee of moving assets through with our Takeda partners, and they're just incredible partners. Different viewpoints, and you really want to find partners that have a different perspective, so that you can kind of synergize. Right? Having partners that think too similarly, although may help speed, may not actually increase the quality necessarily. I guess the saying goes, do you want to go somewhere fast, run alone? Do you want to go somewhere meaningful, run together? And I think there's probably some truth to that. And so I think I like to think of having a diversity of options and assets. I think our portfolio has some partnerships. It also has some wholly owned assets. It has some really high, like late stage, very high, really great opportunities that we think we've significantly de-risked. We have some earlier programs that are a little bit riskier, but the opportunities is quite significant, for example, in autism. And so I think, thinking of your partnerships from a diversity perspective, almost like an optionality perspective, I think is something that I kind of kept close to my heart.
Mhm. I think underlying partnerships and transforming academic research or research of any kind into actual innovation in the form of products that can help people, often is underpinned by patents, and you've got 15 of them, if I'm not incorrect. One of them is, for example, the compositions and methods for therapeutic delivery of microbial communities. Why patent your work? And in the process of patenting this work, were there any conflicts with academic or other partners when it came to these?
Yeah, no, I think that intellectual property is a really important aspect in biotechnology, and actually something that I think academics are starting to hopefully learn a little bit more about. Of before we publish your paper, file IP around. IP central to being able to freely operate and move your ideas forward, um, and also generate the fuel or the resources necessary to be able to move your technology forward. Because to run companies through clinical trials, you need resources, you need investors that trust you to move this new therapy to the clinic, and then to an approval, and then beyond to kind of have a maximal impact. And having some protection around that to ensure that you can take that complete journey is really important.
Mhm. Has the process of getting that protection, though, and having a certain patent under your name, like, led to conflicts before? Because you seem to take a really open and friendly approach to partnerships. But I mean, I've also heard from the other side of things that sometimes when it comes to taking ownership of a certain idea, like, that's when crossroads can get a little hazy and full of conflict.
Yeah, I think conflict arises when there's miscommunication and and or communication happens too late. And so one of the
Mhm.
really important aspects of any type of partnership around ownership and intellectual property is to do that upfront before the inventions have happened, and be very clear and transparent about that. And I've found that as long as those two ingredients are in place, um, I haven't personally had any conflicts around this. And I think as long as you're mission aligned on what you're trying to achieve, that usually it's a pretty seamless conversation. I think folks get folks have more challenges when they don't communicate upfront and are not transparent. And so those are the two ingredients to me that are necessary and are almost prerequisites for any type of collaboration. And this is just one example of a broader collaboration. It's the same for contracting or anything else. Is like, just be clear, be transparent, and that'll usually solve 99% of the problems.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that's a really simple yet clear and beautiful approach to making sure that, like, what can be contentious but necessary is solved very simply. But to pivot back to, I guess, the academic sphere of your work, you've managed to publish so much. You mentioned 200 articles or abstracts in the course of your work, specifically in I guess the industry realm overall. Um, I've heard so much that the industry side of medtech is much more, live fast, make a quick impact, or at least make an impact more quickly than academia can. How has your attachment to research impacted your perspective, or your interactions with others in the industry or in your work with Finch so far?
No, I think to me, it's been a really important part of the journey of publishing the data and helping to shape the field for a couple different reasons. So the first is, um, we partner with academics, and academics carrots are still publications. And to me, that's really important in a true partnership, is that both parties are able to thrive, right? Like the rising tide lifts all boats. And so if you're able to help them accomplish their goals, that's they're going to feel good about that relationship. And it's not a transaction. Like, I'm doing this because of this, but I always want to help people make an impact. And that's how the universe works. And then they're really excited about, either enrolling patients or helping give advice. And I think building those relationships have been really, really important. And publications is just understanding whether it was, I don't know, like helping to build their house or helping to publish it. It didn't really matter to me. It's like helping them, right? Helping them in a genuine, authentic, you know, non-transactional way was really important to me. And this happened to be publications. And that's something I think I've had an ability to help with, and because of my track record in the field and helping to shape, and helping to kind of guide and edit and tweak and contribute and design, given my training. And so that was kind of like, we didn't have a lot of resources as startups. We didn't have, a checkbook that we could, pay big dollars to academics to get their advice or to have a conversation about. And so for me, is my time and to like kind of, sweat equity of like literally working with them. And they become some of my closest friends and some of my closest confidants have been in this field because of that relationship, building things together, writing a book together. These are incredible opportunities. And you get that in real time. I love that. It was a way to help because I felt like I can't I can't rent you what you usually like consult for. We just don't have those resources, but I can help you with your time and what your goals are. So that was like number one. Number two, I think it's for me, it helps separate out some of the company credibility and reputation. And so I think the reason why sometimes industry gets a bad rap is because it feels a little salesy, a little salesy. And not that sales are bad, it's just that if you're not balanced with data and you feel like there's an authentic pillar on what you're trying to do, then it becomes really, really hard to win hearts and minds of clinicians. And for me, that was real, and patients, truthfully, as well. And so, there are companies that have pioneered this. Genentech is an example of where they lead with science and they have a very good reputation of being science centric. And that was almost a model for me and for Finch, I think, of saying we wanted published like quality data. And we had a chance to publish in, I published in New England Journal of Medicine and Gastroenterology and these are really amazing journals because we're thinking about making a big impact and not just from a sales perspective, but legitimately to help build the field forward and really help educate and get the field ready, but also to understand that Finch is one of the leaders in this field. We have a track record. That's what differentiates us from perhaps some of the other folks in the field that are maybe just trying to make a sleight of hand. And so that was important to me to be authentic, to be evidence-based. McMaster, where I train, is a home of evidence-based medicine. And so that kind of really led me is evidence-based industry too, and really follow the data. And I think that's helped add it as a differentiator as well. So I think those are the two kind of big reasons why it's been a really important part for me. And probably me, the last aspect's a bit selfish is I just love doing it, right? Like I was likely down this academic gastroenterology path. And so I naturally curious. I naturally love having conversations with other academics and industry leaders too. Like I love both. I like the collision of that and to bring another lens. And so I sat on guidelines and that was amazing. And so I think all three reasons was the reason why I've had a chance to kind of lean into it. And it's been effective as a tool to galvanize and catalyze and also kind of hopefully separate us from other companies.
Mhm. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I know that we're running short, but I guess two last questions here. Number one, do you ever miss the clinical practice of medicine? I may be mistaken; you might still be practicing. But also, number two, you're back in Canada now. So, what gaps do you see with regard to our handling of medical innovation as opposed to what you've seen during your immersion in the United States, which has reportedly an entirely different culture than Canadian innovation or medical innovation is?
Yeah. So do I miss clinical practice? I will say I don't miss the 3 a.m. GI bleed call, but I do miss elements of it. I would say. So the thing is, you can't have everything all at the same time. And for me, I had an amazing clinical impact. I really enjoyed treating patients. But as a clinician, I could see maybe 1,000 patients or 2,000 patients a year if I was lucky, perhaps, and working my butt off. As a drug developer, I had the opportunity to impact. There's 3 million IBD patients, 500,000 C. diff patients. It's a different step in terms of public health. And in fact, even, for example, venture capital or funding agencies, that's the next step where you can help 5 companies that have 5 new therapies. And that's another impact. Now, I'm not naive to know that it's a very different level of feeling that direct impact, meaning, I can't look in the eye of the GI bleed patient anymore. But my meta public health impact is really wide reaching. And I think that's what, for me at least, in my time at the School of Public Health really taught me is that impact is impact, and you have to you can't solve for everything all at the same time. And for me, solving for maximal impact has always been my prerogative, and my mission. And so I think that's been really powerful for me. So certainly miss elements of it, but I also it's a trade off, and I get elements that I think are incredible and wouldn't have otherwise. In terms of your second question, which is, you're now back in Canada. How are you thinking about the ecosystem here versus in the US? I think differences. They're not bad differences, but they're differences. It depends what you're trying to solve for as a health system. So, in Canada, my experience as a clinician was there are like 4 paths. There's like, you could be a pure play clinician and just see patients all day. And that's, amazing and taking care of patients. And I think that's great. There's the clinical, research pathway where you do academic studies and you apply to CIHR and you kind of go down that pathway. And that's wonderful too. There's the academic administrator. So you kind of do more administration, a little bit of like hospital management, and that's great. And the fourth is teaching, is being a clinical educator. And in fact, I did a bunch of that on my training as well. And I think these are 4 fields that totally make sense. And there's the infrastructure that's built for that. What there's missing is, and I think it's in the US a little bit more, certainly in the Boston and San Francisco area, is that there's a wealth of other opportunities outside of those that I was not really privy to. So for example, I didn't know what business consulting was when I went through training, and like a group like McKinsey or Bain or others. I know physicians that have gone down the business consulting road and started entrepreneurship and started, or gone down a very different path, and the investor side, that's an area that, or an analyst side, right? Those are parts of the finance industry that haven't really been talked about. At least wasn't talked about when I was kind of training on venture capital or other types of opportunities. And then there's also the path that I ultimately took, which is was an entrepreneur and actually spinning out new companies and serially starting new businesses. And I would say those were not really top of mind as opportunities that were even on my radar to think about. Whereas I think, as I was mentioning at MIT, that's kind of an expectation. And at Stanford, I think something like 30% of their class doesn't go on to residency for medical school. They go into business consulting or startups or something else. Now, there might be a reason for that, and maybe that's what we want to solve for. But I think it's at least understanding the landscape of opportunities. To me, I feel like is like would be a step up from a Canadian training perspective to give folks that opportunity. And that's in training. And then also to help young faculty to align incentives, whether that's IP, how much they keep, or how to work with filing IP or spinning out companies or working with tech transfer. All of those opportunities, I think, could be, and I'm just putting my fingers on the pulse again as I'm entering back into Canada. Those are, I think, opportunities for growth. I think they're there. I think they can be accelerated to kind of catch up maybe to the US ecosystem. There's nothing different, in my opinion, about the opportunities that can be created in Canada versus the US. But it kind of makes my heart melt a little bit when probably the most famous accelerator in the world called Y Combinator, it's in the US, where Airbnb and Dropbox came out of. The pedigree, the educational institution that's most commonly represented isn't Harvard, isn't Stanford, isn't MIT, it's Waterloo. So there are folks that are coming from Canada down to the US to be able to accelerate that. And it's certainly happening in the life sciences as well. And so it'd be great if we could kind of keep that and galvanize that kind of within Canada and an ecosystem that is, set to transform Canadian lives. Just like that patient I saw at the very beginning of the story, an 82-year-old British lady. And I think we have the opportunity to do that. And I think we just have to start to maybe question our own dogma a little bit.
That is a beautiful way to wrap the conversation. You really are someone who took debate, for sure, with your outlining of points and that nice little pretty bow to the end of the conversation. I would ask you what pluggables you have to plug, but you showed me the book that I have to plug. It's called The 6 Ds of Fecal Microbiota Transplantation, a primer from decision to discharge and beyond. You can find it on Amazon, or I guess anywhere else you can find books.
And you can find How It's Med at howitsmed.com and at howitsmed on Twitter and LinkedIn. Till next time.